In this room today, each and every one of you matters. That is the topic of my discussion on We Matter. You've all been born, you've been blessed with skills, personalities that no one else in the world has. I know from time to time we think, oh, I would sure like to be that other person, but guess what? They're already taken. So you are you, and again, you've been blessed with that. I want to relate that to, in the profession of parks and recreation planning, community planning, in the history of the United States of America, there have been but just a few moments, just a small number of moments that really stand out that have made a difference all of these years later. I'm going to talk about 3 periods of time. One of them goes back quite a ways, about 1873. That's quite a few years ago. The other is more current in our local area here in the Midwest. About 2011, 2013, we had some rather eventful things happen. And then I want to think about the future and where we would go, let's say mid-century, 2035 to 2050. So during my presentation, I'm going to be touching upon all those 3 periods of time. Now, as I mentioned back in 1873, in terms of having a new America, really, things that's never been done before in building a North America, we were dealing with severe issues at that time, as one might expect. In 1873, lots of people, probably everyone in America at the time, noticed some things. For example, just to mention a few, our largest cities, by the way, were New York City and Chicago at that time. That hasn't changed much, but they were about 1 million people at that time. But the living conditions for many people were just the worst you can possibly imagine. There was tenement building type living. There were documented instances where there would be like 360 people, 40 of which would be children, living in one fairly small tenement building. Basic city services, as we think about them today, really didn't exist in many areas. The slum areas, which were a large part of most of our communities at that time, they still haven't gone away, have they? But we had almost no water service, sewer service, transportation, housing. Social issues were just awful at that time. Well, again, lots of people noticed that, but in terms of We Matter, a gentleman named Daniel Burnham, a Chicago architect, says, I'm noticing this too, but I have skills, I have a passion for doing something about it, and I want to matter, I want to make a difference, I want to be a change agent. So at that time in 1873, Daniel Burnham said, I know I can't change all of these issues with which we're dealing. But I can make a difference by doing what I think would be something that I can do. So he created really what's called a City Beautiful movement. And in essence, again, he's admitting right up front, we can't change all of these things, especially a lot of the social issues. Gangs, things like that. I can't change all of that, but by having a new idea, a way that I can matter, he thought about highly designed buildings, changing the environment, large parkways, beautiful streets going both directions with a large median in the middle. We have a lot of those all over the country, but those are highly landscaped. There's a lot of monuments, public art. They're delightful parkways to travel on. And at some points, even they were designed to go through some blighted areas to clean those up. So he had those kinds of ideas. And then, of course, in the community planning business, you always have to have green spaces where citizens want to go and get away from the daily grind, get into those spaces and take your mind off of what's going on the negative side. So it's all about that. Our most notable green spaces where he was working, for example, Central Park in New York City. Now, Kessler was the designer, but people like Burnham had the idea that we ought to create these kinds of spaces, big and small. Well, that was in 1873. He mattered. We're looking back, 141 years later, and thinking about Daniel Burnham because of how he made a difference. Then we fast forward just a little bit to 1906. In 1906, Joseph Lee, New York City, cared a lot about young people. and how they should have greater opportunities than what they were having at the time. He invested a few dollars, at the time $25,000. Today's money is $540,000. But nonetheless, he wanted to matter. He had his moment, he recognized the issues, and so he stepped up and created the first playground movement in America, which subsequently in 1930 became the National Recreation Association, and in 1965, with 50,000 members now, became the National Recreation and Park Association. Those are a couple of moments at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s where these gentlemen recognized the issues and says, I want to matter. I think I can make a difference. Fast forward then to just a few short years ago, in the Midwest, we had devastating tornadoes both in Joplin, Missouri in 2011 and in Moore, Oklahoma in 2013. I'm attached to those communities because I did the planning for them. And everything you see today came as a result of this master planning process. Now, those were moments, weren't they, in the history of those communities and in the history of our area surrounding those. Chris Cotton in Joplin, Missouri, Director of Parks and Recreation. Todd Jensen, Director of Parks and Recreation in Moore, Oklahoma. Of course, with a lot of other people, but they recognized that on their local level, this was a moment in time that had to be dealt with. They took the position that we're not just going to clean up, but like the city administrator at Moore, Oklahoma said, Mr. Steve Eady says, we're going to transform our community. It's a spot on I-35 halfway between Oklahoma City on the north and Norman, Oklahoma on the south. And people just would drive by I-35 going to Oklahoma City or Norman or somewhere else. But now you get off of I-35, and for you music lovers, that's where Toby Keith lives. And I got to meet him during the process. They transformed their community. They now have their own central park, this huge green space right downtown. And it is full of everything you would ever want to do as a place where you'd either want to visit and, better than that, live or take your business there for economic development purposes. So those two moments in time, people mattered. They had some skills, they had some personality, they stepped up, and here we are talking about them now. In case of Burnham and Lee, 141 years later, Todd and Chris a few years later, and no doubt their names will live on forever. But then we fast forward to more like 2035 to 2050, a few years from now, only 18 years to 2035. But there's a group called the Center for Strategic International Studies. That part's not very important. But as they start looking at the future and these future moments where someone with your kind of skills, your kind of personality is going to have to step up. And in that 2035 time frame, there's these 7 world-changing revolutions that we're going to have to deal with. There's an acronym for those. PRTIESG. PRTIESG. Kind of a little rhythm there. So just briefly over those. P stands for population. We currently in the world have 7.3 to 5 billion people. Pretty good number. On the problematic side, though, in 2035, that number is going to be to about 9.3 billion people. Now, unfortunately, in a way, but most of that growth is going to occur in nations that can't deal with it. They don't have the infrastructure to deal with it. What's going to happen? For us in the United States of America, we have a declining population. What are the ramifications of that as we move forward, especially now with the immigration talks that are going on in Washington and around the world? So population is a revolution that we have to deal with. Resources is the R. Scientists say right now that we probably cannot feed a world with 9.3 billion people in it. That gets pretty serious. If you can't feed the projected population, what are you going to do? T stands for the technology. We're living in that era, of course. We all have our phones laid out there because they're not too far away from us. Got to be right there all the time. So technology, of course, can be good or bad. And so it's going to be an opportunity or an issue. Going to have to try to keep working on that. I is similar to that with information and knowledge. There's so much data readily available to us now. What do we do with it? How do we use it? How much of it can we digest and really do something with? E is economic. We live in a global economy. Think right now, even in America, it's not had a lot of press yet, and it's likely to not happen. But you know there's a group in California wanting to secede from the Union? That's a big percentage of our economy just in America. And have you read about the Brexit issues, where the United Kingdom is trying to get away from the European Union? And that's moving forward slowly, but they're still trying to do that. So economic, it's a real issue. Security, have you heard of ISIS or ISIL? And now each one of us, depending on where we live, some more so than others, but if you're in New York City, for example, you know, it's every moment of every day where something catastrophic could happen. And then G is for governance. We have a lot of non-traditional countries now, and do they even want to assimilate into the rest of more traditional governed countries, and what does that mean? So we've had our 1873 experience where we had issues. People stepped up, Mr. Burnham, Mr. Lee. We have some more current, more local issues, but they're all over the world, of course, but with the Joplin and more examples. But then moving into the 2035, 2050 and the 7 resolutions, someone, and it could be someone in this room today, right? I have no doubt that someone in this room has the skill set, the personality, the passion to matter. Now that can happen at different levels. It could be individually, it could be as a part of a group, or it could be a part of a community, but someone in this community could then become that person that 100 years from now folks are saying, wow, did you see what K.O. did 100 years ago that made a difference in his community, in his area, in his region? And so I just leave you with that thought, actually, is that we do matter. We have specific examples over history where people have mattered, and sometimes it really is just that one person who chooses to do so. So that's my challenge for you today, is that what will you do that matters in your lifetime?